What up, Hyperchange? Today we're talking about disruption in the podcasting market and specifically how Spotify is uniquely positioned to potentially make a huge push and dominate the podcasting world. The company has recently announced two huge acquisitions in the podcasting space. They've acquired Gimlet Media and Anchor as of yesterday. And so I want to make a video breaking down why Spotify made those acquisitions, what that entails, and then my own Moonshot Monday initiative for how Spotify could really take over the podcast game. So this is the press release that Spotify put out. They're making strategic acquisitions to accelerate the growth in podcasting. Spotify has been dabbling with original content podcasts and trying to push more into the podcast realm since their IPO, and now we are seeing them bet all in on this. Now, they didn't disclose the exact terms of the deal in this press release, but Recode is out with an article saying that the Gimlet Media acquisition cost, somewhere around $200 million. My guess is Anchor was done for around a similar price, maybe a little bit less. So it looks like Spotify is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get into podcasts. This is probably some of the biggest M&A that's happened in this space, frankly, ever. So now let's talk about what these companies actually are. So Gimlet Media is a content company that produces a bunch of podcasts. If you go to their website, they have all these very, fancy high-end podcasts that they're producing with different, sort of celebrities or hosts that they partner with to produce these. Then they have a whole advertising network where they sell this. Essentially, Gimlet Media is like, let's say you think of a Hollywood studio that produces blockbuster movies. That's what Gimlet Media is, but for blockbuster premium, super high content podcasts. And so this is their website. They already have a bunch of content on Spotify, and Gimlet Media is really interesting in their business model because not only have they been dabbling in podcasts and these original podcasts that are seeing tremendous popularity, like Homecoming or like Reply All, which are these very relevant, culturally iconic podcasts, but Amazon, what I thought is so interesting is Homecoming in particular ended up being spun out of a podcast into an original TV show. They partnered with Amazon Prime that starred Julia Roberts that has now gone on to be critically acclaimed. So Gimlet Media is this very fascinating little entity of producing original content that's in the form of podcasts, but then once those podcasts gain enough popularity, you can take it in, turn it into a TV show, turn it into something else, turn it into merchandise. And so really an original content company. So I think what that tells me, Spotify buying Gimlet Media, is they want to start producing original content podcasts. Just like Netflix produces original content shows, that's what Netflix wants to do with audio. So that's the Gimlet Media side of the acquisition. Anchor's on the other end of the podcasting spectrum. Anchor is an app and a platform that gained popularity because it was super easy to allow anyone to just record on their phone, create a podcast, and submit it and blast it out to all these other platforms. So Anchor was a dual app where you could listen to podcasts, but also an app where you could really, what it did was allowed you to record podcasts and publish them. And a little history on the podcasting industry. I've tried to start a podcast a bunch of times, honestly, like failing on Hyperchange. And the reason, what's so interesting about the podcasting industry is it's not like I just upload my thing to Spotify. Like I literally can't upload my podcast to Spotify. I had to go sign up for a host. Like I was originally using SoundCloud, and then I would use SoundCloud to upload my files, and then SoundCloud would be synced up with my iTunes feed, with, Spotify feed, with my Google Play feed, and then it would automatically send it out to all these networks. Then I was having trouble with Spotify, so I moved to Anchor actually as my podcasting host, and then Anchor, frankly, has totally dropped the ball. I've been emailing Anchor for like the past months because they stopped now whenever I upload an episode to Anchor, it doesn't get blasted to all the other platforms. Anyway, the point being here is there's a huge back-end pain point in the podcasting industry of where do you upload and where do you host your content to be distributed. And that is what Anchor was trying to solve. So now, taking a step back, Spotify has acquired Gimlet Media, premium content production, Anchor, premium content sort of producer and hosting website. And so I think these are two huge, incredible acquisitions that fit Spotify's niche of, we want to be that platform to allow any sort of person to unlock their creativity and immediately start uploading. That's what Anchor does. And then Gimlet gives us this landmark original content why people are going to want to come to Spotify and listen to it. Among failing from my own podcast, I've actually been hitting up Spotify nonstop to try and launch my own original content podcast on Spotify. So Spotify, if you're watching, you should take me up on that. And then the more and more I was thinking about it, a podcast I've been getting more and more into on my own is the Joe Rogan Experience. I feel like the Joe Rogan podcast, and he has this unbelievable pioneer in terms of, the new podcasting era and this ushering in a new wave of content of these super long form multi-hour interviews. The infamous one he had with Elon Musk where he smokes a blunt. I mean, he just had Jack Dorsey talking about Twitter on his podcast. I mean, he has had MKBHD. Joe Rogan's podcast is almost like the epicenter of culture, of internet culture right now, at least in my opinion. And so I calculated, why is Spotify buying Gimlet Media? Why are they buying Anchor? Like, in my opinion, if they want to buy a podcast and make it original content that people will flock to their platform in the millions on, that is the Joe Rogan Experience. Imagine if Spotify owned the content of the Joe Rogan Experience. You could only listen to it on Spotify. The only way you could watch the videos of the Joe Rogan Experience was on the Spotify app. I mean, they could even launch themselves into being a video platform if they acquire Joe Rogan. I, for instance, only watch Joe Rogan live on YouTube. I don't even listen to his podcast, even though it's technically a podcast. And so I went ahead and for fun, this is Hyperchange. Of course, I'm going to crunch the numbers on how much money is Joe Rogan making? What is the revenue potential of his podcast? How much would Spotify pay for his podcast? Does this make sense? So I put all these numbers in a Google sheet, which I'm going to put a link in the description so you can download and play with yourself. And I went to Social Blade to get the data, which is an unbelievable resource. So Joe Rogan has 2 channels on YouTube. The first one here is the Powerful JRE, where he just posts the full podcast. That channel is skyrocketing in terms of monthly views, but as you can see, recently hitting almost 60 views a month before doing, well over 50 million views a month. So we have one channel doing, skyrocketing towards 60 million views a month plus. His other channel he has is JRE Clips. Now, JRE Clips is a channel that is focused on very short content that is cut from his longer interviews. So he basically repurposes his content into different formats. There's a whole separate channel for this. And the JRE Clips channel has even more views than the Powerful JRE channel. It has 94 million as of January. So he has 2 channels generating tens of millions of views. And remember, this is an audio podcast, but these are video views. And so if we go to the spreadsheet, I calculated, 50 million views a month for Powerful JRE, a conservative estimate on the 60 million he just posted. And then I calculated a $15 CPM, revenue per 1,000 views. Now, this is based on a very rough estimate of my understanding of how YouTube ads work. Longer content means you can fit in more ad breaks, which means there's higher revenue per view. And that's why the CPM's higher. So I kind of assume for super long views, he's making $15 CPMs. And that results in, if you assume 50 million views a month, $750,000 in monthly revenue for the Powerful JRE channel. We do the same calculation, 90 million times $5 CPM, because it's a lot shorter version format of content. And we're looking at $450,000 in revenue a month. And this is just YouTube, over $1 million in revenue per month. If we go to audio ads, I tried to calculate, I Googled the average sort of CPM for a podcast for a 60-second ad. It was $25. I assume that Joe Rogan runs 2 60-second ads on a super long podcast. Just when I've listened to it, that seems about right. So if he averages 2 ads a podcast at 25 CPM, he averages 50 million monthly downloads across all those audio platforms. We're looking at 2.5 million in monthly revenue from the audio advertising business. So if you combine the audio and the video advertising business for Joe Rogan and I annualized it, I'm looking at $44 million in revenue for the Joe Rogan Experience. This is a total back of the napkin calculation. I could be way off. Joe Rogan, correct me if I'm wrong, but anyway, the point is Joe Rogan's podcast, even if I'm remotely right, $40 million a year in revenue. And, YouTube ad revenue is 100% gross margin. YouTube's already taken its cut when you're looking at this number. The audio ad, they've already taken their cut. So this money, that 44 million is just money coming in. Your only expenses are your studio and whatever costs maybe to get guests there, maybe a little bit of equipment, maybe a little bit of editing, but like the costs are minimal. My guess is that 44 million probably costs maybe $1 million or $2 million or $3 million a year to produce in full costs. I don't know. Maybe that could be way off, but I think like 90 or 80% of this revenue would drop right to the bottom line. So my thing is the Joe Rogan Experience here as its own little company, forget about Spotify. The Joe Rogan Experience, in my estimation, it could be making $20 to $30 million in profit each year across its advertising platforms. And you value that at 10, 20 times earnings. I mean, Joe Rogan Experience, his podcast alone is at least worth $100 million. In my opinion, it's worth several $100 million. So this is just sort of blew my mind when I ran these numbers because I realized like Spotify, I think, has a huge opportunity to partner with not only, companies like Gimlet and Anchor, but truly individual content creators and being able to own that content, only put it on Spotify, and then own the video version of that podcast content, I think is incredible. And I think Joe Rogan, even if you think hundreds of millions for a 5-year deal for Joe Rogan's all a podcast to be exclusive on Spotify sounds like a lot of money. Like, I just think the podcasts are becoming the new radio. The best, iconic podcast host is almost like the Howard Stern of our day. Like, he has the pulse on culture. There's so much attention and value and eyeballs on Joe Rogan and what he says and who goes on there. I mean, it makes sense to me that if you see how many people, just millions of people are talking about it on the internet every time he interviews everybody. I mean, it makes sense to me that this is worth tens of millions of dollars. So my Moonshot Monday is, if Spotify has any gas left in the tank that they want to use to acquire podcasts, they should buy out Joe Rogan, figure out how to get his content exclusively onto their platform, as well as the videos. And I think this is how Spotify could really become, a pioneer of original podcast content. And Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify, writes this beautiful blog post about the acquisitions where he says that in the long term, Spotify really wants to become an audio platform, and he believes that 20% of all Spotify listening will be non-music content like podcasts. So Spotify and they say that now with these acquisitions, they've become the second biggest podcast company in the world behind Apple. So I think there's huge podcast ambitions here. I think the way for Spotify to do it is to get original content on their platform by paying for creators. I think Joe Rogan is the best example of this. He's the elephant in the room of the podcasting world, and I think getting Joe Rogan is the real way to command this. Anyway, that is my Moonshot Monday. Spotify should buy the Joe Rogan Experience podcast in a 5-year deal for all of his video and audio content for $200 million and make that the landmark bedrock of their podcasting platform. And I think that'll be huge success. I think he's underpriced at $100 million, frankly. Anyway, that's my pitch, Moonshot Monday. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, Spotify, reply to my emails. Hit me up if you're interested. I would love to do an original content podcast and team up with Spotify, so plugging myself there. Anyway, this is Hyperchange. Huge shout out to our Patreon supporters, producers, funding the channel. I'll see you guys next time. Peace. Oh, P.S. I haven't made a video updating Spotify's financials and their recent quarterly results. Didn't have time to get to it in this video, but there will be an update soon on the financials and valuation and sort of, business, strategy analysis of Spotify. So that's coming up too. Anyway, peace.